Hi. I don't have much faith in the world today. I think it's pretty tragic. Pretty disgusted. But I'll keep reading this like it's anything that I can control. And going on very poignantly, the critic as judge, jury, and executioner. Juries everywhere. As noted above, not all survivors hide their outer critic. Fight types and subtypes can take the passive out of passive-aggressive and become quite aggressive. The survivor who is polarized to the outer critic often develops a specious belief that his subjectively derived standards of correctness are objective truth. When triggered, he can use the critic's combined detective-lawyer-judge function to persecute the other for betrayal with little or no evidence. Imagine slights, insignificant peccadillos, misread facial expressions, and inaccurate psychic perceptions can be used to put relationships on trial. In the proceedings, the outer critic typically refuses to admit positive evidence. Extenuating circumstances will not be considered in the kangaroo court. Moreover, any relational disappointment can render a guilty verdict that sentences the relationship to capital punishment. This is also the process by which jealousy can become toxic and run riot. On another level, the outer critic is skilled at building a case to justify occupying a higher moral ground. From the lofty position, the critic then claims the right to micromanage others. Typically, this is rationalized as being for the other's own good. This control, however, is usually wielded on an unconscious level to protect the survivor from any reenactment of early parental abuse or neglect. Micromanagement of others also devolves into a host of controlling behaviors. Fight types treat others like captive audiences, give them unsolicited performance evaluations, make unreasonable demands for improvement, and control their time schedules, social calendars, and food and clothing choices. In worst-case scenarios, they dramatically act out their jealousy, often without cause. At its absolute worst, outer critic relating looks like taking prisoner, not making friends. Scapegoating. Scapegoating is an outer critic process whereby personal frustration is unfairly dumped onto others. Scapegoating is typically fueled by unworked through anger about childhood abandonment. Displacing anger on the wrong target, however, fails to release or resolve old or unrelated hurts. Scapegoating is often a reenactment of a parent's abusive role. It is blind imitation of a parent who habitually released his frustration by indiscriminately raging. When a fight-type parent scapegoats those around him, he forces a perverse kind of mirroring. He is making sure that when he feels bad, so does everyone else. It's like a bumper sticker I saw the other day. If mama ain't happy, nobody's happy. I witnessed this common example of scapegoating several times in my childhood. My parents hated anyone who was late. If one of us children were even a minute late for something, they felt absolutely justified in blasting us with their righteous indignation. This was true even though we all learned very quickly to be anally punctual. Because of their untreated ptsd, however, their anger was the tip of the iceberg of the unexpressed rage about their own childhood hurts. In this case, they were flashing back to the pain of their parents' chronic lateness and failure to show up to meet their normal childhood needs. Mindfulness and shrinking the outer critic. Reducing outer critic reactivity requires a great deal of mindfulness. This is as essential for fight types who act out aggressively as it is for those trauma types who internally rage against the entire human group known as fucking people. It is also of great importance for any survivor who is locked into alienation because of the judgmentalness of his outer critic. Mindfulness, once again, is the process of becoming intricately aware of everything that is going on inside of us, especially thoughts, images, feelings, and sensations. In terms of outer critic work, it is essential that we become more mindful of both the cognitive and emotional content of our thoughts. This is the same as in inner critic work, where the two key fronts of critic shrinking are cognitive and emotional. Cognitive work in both cases involves the demolition and rebuilding processes of thought stopping and thought substitution, respectively. And emotional work in both instances is grief work. It is removing the critic's fuel supply, the unexpressed childhood anger and the uncried tears of a lifetime of abandonment. When mindfulness appears to intensify the critic, in early recovery the outer critic unfortunately seems to become nastier and stronger the more we challenge it. We may even think we are counterproductively stirring it up or making it worse by daring to resist it. When mindfulness of the critic seems to strengthen it, we are typically flashing back to how our parents rebuked our early protests at their attack. This is often impossible to remember because our dysfunctional parents typically kill our protest function before our memory function comes online. Nonetheless, fear of parental reprisal is often the unconscious dynamic that scares us out of challenging our own toxic thinking. This is why survivors in early recovery often need to invoke the instinct of angry self-protection to power their thought stopping. There is another dynamic occurring when a critic work seems to strengthen rather than weaken the critic. As we become less disassociated, we begin to notice critic processes that were there all along the horizon of our awareness. Our childhood survival was aided by learning to disassociate from the painful critic processes. Consequently, many of us come into recovery barely able to even notice the critic. Our recovering depends on using mindfulness to decrease our habits of disassociation. Only then can we see the critic programs that we need to deconstruct, shrink, and consciously disidentify from. This typically involves learning to tolerate the pain that comes from discovering how pervasive and strong the critic is. This pain is sometimes a hard pill to swallow because progress in fighting the critic is hard to see at first. And then, even when our shrinking work is effective, progress usually feels disappointingly slow and gradual. This is especially true during flashbacks, when the critic can seem to be strong as ever. As stated earlier, the critic grew carcinogenically in childhood. It is like a pervasive cancer that requires many uncomfortable operations to remove. Nonetheless, we can choose to face the acute pain of critic shrinking work because we want to end the chronic pain of having the critic destroy our enjoyment in life. It is the fight of a lifetime. Thought substitution and correction. Supplanting the critic. Many of us are still developmentally arrested in our need to orient our psyches towards noticing what is good, trustworthy, and lovable about others and life in general. Or maybe that makes us fools. In working to shrink the outer critic, thought substitution is the practice of invoking positive thoughts and images of others to help erode the critic's intimacy-spoiling habit of picking them apart. One helpful thought substitution exercise is to list 5 recollections of positive interactions with a given friend, as well as 5 of her attributes. This same technique works well when we self-apply it to help us separate from our inner critic's negative self-image. Toolbox 5 in Chapter 16 contains a written exercise to broaden your appreciation of select others who have benefited you. Since thoughts typically give rise to speech, I also recommend that you practice the 5 positives to 1 negative guideline when giving feedback to a loved one. John Gottman's research has shown that this ratio is characteristic of how intimacy-successful relationships communicate. This is also key because the outer critic was spawned in childhood by parental modeling that at least reversed this ratio. Grieving short-circuits the outer critic. The role of grieving and shrinking the outer critic is as crucial as it is with the inner critic. As with the inner critic, anger at the outer critic helps to silence it, and crying helps to evaporate it. We can use the anger of our grief to energize our thought corrections. This helps us to challenge the critic entrenched all or none perspective that everyone is as dangerous as our parents. Moreover, when our grieving opens into crying, it can release the fear that the outer critic uses to frighten us out of opening to others. Tears can also help us to realize that our loneliness is now causing us much unnecessary pain. This in turn can motivate us to open to the possibility of finding safe connections. The grief is never ending when you're raising a boy with a misogynist, though. Defueling the outer critic work. Defueling the outer critic via working the transference. Transference, aka projection, aka displacement, occurs when unprocessed feelings from the past amplify present time feelings. A key characteristic of outer critic dominated flashbacks is that we displace emotional pain from past relationships into current ones. Transference is the pipeline from the past that supplies the critic with anger to control, attack, or disapprove of present relationships. As a baby thrives on love, so does the outer critic thrive on anger. Like a parasite, the outer critic gorges on repressed anger and then erroneously assigns it to present-day disappointments. The most common transferential dynamic that I witness occurs when leftover hurt about a parent gets displaced onto someone we perceive as hurting us in the present. When this occurs, we respond to them with a magnified anger or anguish that is out of proportion to what they did. Transference can also grossly distort our perceptions, and sometimes we can misperceive a harmless person as being hurtful. Transference can fire up the critic to imagine slights that do not actually occur. Transference typically runs wild when the outer critic is on a rampage. Just as the inner critic transmutes unreleased anger into self-hate, the outer critic uses it to control and or push others away. Rightfully so. A lot of people that ain't worth being in your life. Unexpressed and unworked through anger about childhood hurt is a hidden reserve that the critic can always tap into. The anger work of grieving the loss of childhood is so essential because it breaks the critic's supply line to this anger. Grieving out old unexpressed pain about our poor parenting gradually deconstructs the process of transferring it unfairly onto others. This is crucial because love and intimacy are murdered when the critic habitually projects old anger out at an intimate. Healthy outer critic venting. There are times when venting from the outer critic perspective is healthy, self-protective behavior. Sometimes the outer critic's judgments are accurate. Yeah. Sometimes people are acting as abusively as our parents did in childhood. Yep. In this vein, there are two healthy applications of outer critic aggressiveness. One is to protect ourselves when someone is actually attacking us. The other is in the work of grieving the losses of childhood, as we shall see in the next chapter. Survivors benefit immeasurably from angrily judging their parents' atrocious abuse and neglect. Road rage, transference, and the outer critic. Let us take another look at how the outer critic displays anger from the past and present-day relationships. My client Johnny came in for his session boiling with road rage. Something infuriated him that had just occurred on his drive to my office. Before his butt hit the couch, he launched away. That pompous SOB, people are so obnoxious. Everyone drives like they are the only one on the road. What a jerk. Driving like he owns the whole road, not giving a shit about anybody but himself. Nobody cares about anybody but themselves. Oh God, don't let me get started on my wife. I don't know why I get out of bed in the morning. This jerk must have forgotten what turn signals are for. I felt like crashing right into the stuck-up bastard and his shiny new Beamer. Johnny radiated anger a full 360 degrees. He hated the driver who had cut him off, all the drivers on the road, his wife, his employees, his neighbors, the government, and last, but thankfully not least, his overcharging therapist, who was always pretending to be so empathetic. Johnny was a fawn fight type. Usually he was mostly fawn. In our 2 years of working together, I had never seen him so enraged, and I was quite taken back. I was indeed straining to hold an empathetic position, but I knew he was in a flashback. I encouraged him to further ventilate by hitting a tennis racket on a cushion. This is a classic anger release work technique for externalizing anger in a non-harmful way. Johnny beat it like his life depended on it. When his cat-hearting petered out, I asked him to close his eyes. I then suggested that he ask himself if his feelings of outrage had a trail into the past. After a moment I said, "I'm so mad, I don't want to do anything that you say right now." After a moment he said, "I'm so mad I don't want to do anything you say right now. And it's weird because I know you're fishing for my father, but I keep thinking of my mother. She was such a wimp. She'd never drive like that asshole in the Beamer, and she didn't rant and rave at me like he did. But I just feel so pissed at her for putting up with him for all those years, and never once standing up for me or protecting me. It's bad enough I got him for a father, but it's even more unfair I got her too." Johnny did another round of venting with his tennis racket. "I thought mothers were programmed to stick up for their kids. Like the mother bear shit. It's so unfair. It's so unfucking believably fair. Unfair. I'd just like to shake her out of that numb trance she'd go into. Just shake some freaking sense into her." And then the tears came. Shortly after they subsided, the epiphany arrived. It made him laugh, genuinely. It was the laughter of relief that we sometimes get when we finally understand why something is really bothering us. He said, "This sounds pretty far-fetched, and I like the psychobabble, and like that psychobabble I hate. But it's the goddamn unfairness of life that just pisses me off so much. You know that you got the Queen of Spades bad luck. That bad luck of being the one person in the crowd who gets crapped on by a pigeon. That cursed luck of getting dealt those assholes from the parenting deck. It's goddamn unfair. Dad and Mom's unfairness was fucking legendary. And that jerk on the freeway making a lane change without signaling was unfair too. I mean, if I hadn't seen him, I could have gotten into a serious accident. But if I am honest, it wasn't really all that bad. I had plenty of time to adjust and would have been a lousy driver myself if I hadn't. But I mean, it was still dangerous though. But nothing compared to growing up in that house. Now that was pure, unadulterated danger for you. I guess my rage was mostly about how unfair it was that I had to grow up in that sorry excuse for a home. Road rage and the less intense irritations we experience with our fellow drivers are common forms of outer critic transference. When we become more mindful of our driving frustrations or other minor everyday annoyances, we can look below the tip of the iceberg for old, unexpressed anger and hurt that it reminds us of. I encourage you to experiment with this next time you are inordinately angry at some driver for a relative minor driving mistake. You can try asking yourself, what is this situation or feeling reminding me of? In the next chapter, we will explore more deeply the process of grieving through the old hurts that we discover when we get to the bottom of our flashbacks. Boom, boom, boom. Okay, I have 15 more minutes. I'm going to do it. Go on to chapter 11, grieving. It's not fair how much of this we each got to do alone. It's really, he's right, it's really not fair. And it's so unfair that we pass it down because we can't possibly heal alone. Chapter 11, Grieving. Grieving is an irreplaceable tool for resolving the overwhelming feelings that arise during emotional flashbacks. Moreover, grieving is the key process for working through the host of losses that come from growing up in a CPTSD-inducing family. We grieve the losses of childhood because these losses are like deaths of important parts of ourselves. Effective grieving brings these parts back into life. In this chapter, we describe the healing that is available through the 4 practices of grieving: angering, crying, verbal ventilation, and feeling. If you find that crying or angering is inaccessible, does not help, or makes you feel worse, then your recovery work may need to focus more on deconstructing and shrinking your inner critic. That's so confusing, though. It's hard. So little good reflection in the world. Grieving expands insight and understanding. I saw grief drinking a cup of sorrow and called out, "It tastes sweet, doesn't it?" "You have caught me," grief answered. "And you've ruined my business. How can I sell sorrow when you know it's blessing?" Insight, as crucially important as it is never enough to attain the deeper levels of recovering. No amount of intention or epiphany can bypass the survivor's need to learn to lovingly care for himself when he is in an emotional flashback. It is crucial that we respond to ourselves with kindness when we feel scared, sad, mad, or bad. Grieving aids the survivor immeasurably to work through the death-like experiences of being lost and trapped in an emotional flashback. Grieving metabolizes our most painful abandonment feelings, especially those that give rise to suicidal ideation, and at their worst, active suicidality. Recoveries also need to grieve the death of their early attachment needs. We must grieve the awful fact that safety and belonging was scarce or non-existent in our own families. We need to mourn the myriad of heartbreaks of our frustrated attempts to win approval and affection from our parents. Grieving also supports recovery from the many painful death-like losses caused by childhood traumatization. Key childhood losses addressed through this book are all the crucial developmental arrests that we suffered. The most essential of these are the deaths of our self-compassion and our self-esteem, as well as our ability to protect ourselves and fully express ourselves. Grieving the absence of parental care. As our capacity to grieve evolves, we typically uncover a great deal of unresolved grief about the deadening absence of the nurturance we needed to develop and thrive. Here are the key types of parental nurturing that all children need in order to flourish. Knowing about these unmet needs can help you grieve out the unreleased pain that comes from having grown up with that type of support. Moreover, this knowledge can guide you to reparent and interact with yourself more nurturingly. 1. Verbal nurturance. Eager participation in multidimensional conversation. Generous amounts of praise and positive feedback. Willingness to entertain all questions. Teaching, reading stories, providing sources for ongoing verbal development. 2. Spiritual nurturance. Seeing and reflecting back to the child his or her essential worth, basic goodness, and loving nature. Engendering experiences of joy, fun, and love to maintain the child's innate sense that life is a gift. Spiritual or philosophical guidance to help the child integrate painful aspects of life. Nurturing the child's creative self-expression. Frequent exposure to nature. 3. Emotional nurturance. Meeting the child consistently with caring regard and interest. Welcoming and valuing the child's full emotional expression. Modeling non-abusive expression of emotions. Teaching safe ways to release anger that does not hurt the child or others. Generous amounts of love, warmth, and tenderness and compassion. Honoring tears as a way of releasing hurt. being a safe refuge, humor. I'll never be able to be this for myself. For physical nurturance, affection and protection, healthy diet and sleep schedule, teaching habits of grooming, discipline, and responsibility. Helping the child develop hobbies outside interests and own sense of personal style. Helping the child balance rest, play, and work. My book, The Tao of Fully Feeling, contains extensive guidelines and encouragements for identifying and grieving the losses of childhood. It is often difficult to become motivated to grieve losses that occurred so long ago. Many of these losses seem so nebulous that trying to embrace grieving is a bit like trying to embrace dental work. Who wants to go to the dentist, but who doesn't go once the toothache becomes acute? Soul ache is considerably harder to assign to the losses of childhood, yet those who take the grieving journey described below come to know unquestionably that the core of their soul ache and psychological suffering is in the unworked through losses of growing up with abandoning parents. These losses have to be grieved until the person really gets how much her caretakers were not caretakers, and how much of her parents were not her allies. She needs to grieve until she stops blaming herself for the abuse and the neglect. She needs to grieve until she fully realizes that her abysmal parenting practices gave her that awful gift that keeps on giving, ptsd. She needs to grieve until she understands how her learned habit of automatic self-abandonment is a reenactment of their abject failure to be there for her. Warning these awful realities empowers our efforts to develop a multidimensional practice of self-care. As we grieve more effectively, our capacities for self-compassion and self-protection grow, and our psyche becomes increasingly user-friendly. Grieving ameliorates flashback. Pain is excess energy crying out for release. Grieving sometimes seems sacramental to me in its ability to move me out of the abandonment. That extremely painful and upsetting amalgam of fear, shame, and depression that is at the emotional core of most flashbacks. A survivor can learn to grieve himself out of fear, the death of feeling safe. He can learn to grieve himself out of shame, the death of feeling worthy. He can learn to grieve himself out of depression, the death of feeling fully alive. With sufficient grieving, the survivor gets that he was innocent and eminently unlovable as a child, as he mourns the bad luck of being born to loving parents, of not being born to loving parents. He finds within himself a fierce, unshakable self-allegiance. He becomes ready, willing, and able to be there for himself no matter what he is experiencing, internally or externally. Grief work also releases you from the impatience and frustration that can arise when you get re-stuck in an inner critic attack. This is especially important during those monster flashbacks when the critic can bully you into wanting to give up. At such times, angering and crying at this terrible intrusion from your past can rescue you from forgetting how far you have come and how much safer you are now. Inner critic hindrances to grieving. The greatest hindrance to effectively grieving is typically the inner critic. When the critic is especially toxic, Grieving may be counterproductive and contraindicated in early recovery. Those who were repeatedly pathologized and punished for emoting in childhood may experience grieving as an exacerbation of their flashbacks rather than relieving them. I have worked with numerous survivors whose tears immediately are triggered them into toxic shame. Their own potentially soothing tears elicited terrible self-attacks. I'm so pathetic. No wonder nobody can stand me. God, I'm so unlovable when I snivel like this. I fuck up and then make myself more of a loser by whining about it. What good is crying for yourself? It only makes you weaker. This latter response is particularly ironic. For once grieving is protected from the critic, nothing can restore a person's inner strength and coping capacity like a good cry. I have diffused active suicidality on dozens of occasions by simply eliciting the suffering person's tears. Anger can also immediately trigger the survivor into toxic shame. This is often true of instances where there is only an angry thought or fantasy. Dysfunctional parents typically reserve their worst punishment for their child's anger. This then traps the child's anger inside. Critic management is often the primary work of early-stage grief work. This work involves recognizing the ways the critic is blocked or shaming the process of grieving. As disidentification from the critic increases, grieving can be the best initiated with low-intensity verbal ventilation. Over time, verbal ventilation can be allowed to gradually increase in sad and angry intonations. Once the critic has been sufficiently diminished, and once thought-corrective techniques have made the psyche more user-friendly, a person begins to tap into grief's sweet relief-granting potential. He learns to grieve in a way that promotes and enhances compassion for abandoned child he was, and for the survivor he is today, still struggling in those throes of painful flashbacks. Defueling the critic through grieving. Fear drives the toxic inner critic. The critic feeds off fear and flashes the survivor back to the frightening times of childhood. She gets stuck seeing herself only through her parents' contemptuous, intimidating, or rejecting eyes. She then imitates them and scornfully mocks herself as defective, ugly, and unlovable. She scares herself with endangerment scenarios and abhors herself for insignificant imperfections. Because fear is core emotional experience, emotional tools are needed to manage the fright that runs haywire during a flashback. Healthy angering and crying can short-circuit fear from morphing into the flashback, triggering cognition of the critic. I have seen grieving bring the critic's devastation programs of drasticizing and catastrophizing to a screeching halt on thousands of occasions. It appears that children are hardwired to release fear through angering and crying. The newborn baby mourning the death of living safely and fully contented inside the mother utters the first of many angry cries, not only to call for nurturance and attention, but also to release her fear. In the dysfunctional family, however, the traumatizing parent soon eradicates the child's capacity to emote. The child becomes afraid and ashamed of her own tears and anger. Tears get shut off and anger gets trapped inside, and is eventually turned against the self as self-attack, self-hate, self-disgust, and self-rejection. Self-hate is the most grievous reenactment of parental abandonment. Over time, anger also becomes fuel for the critic and actually exacerbates fear by creating an increasingly dangerous internal environment. Anything the survivor says, thinks, feels, imagines, or wishes for is subjected to an intimidating inner attack.